Hello everybody and welcome to another Doctor Who review. This time I'm reviewing our Big Finish monthly adventure. It's Whispers of Terror. So this is the third Big Finish monthly adventure that was released, starring Colin Baker as the 6th Doctor and Nicola Bryant as Perry. The Doctor and Perry arrive at the Museum of Oral Antiquities and soon get themselves in a spot of bother, as it seems that a well-known politician, Vistine Crane, has died in the museum. His running mate, Beth Purnell, is part of a plot to manipulate his speeches for her political gain, and the Doctor and Perry come across one of the people trying to manipulate those speeches, Gough Fotherall, who has just been electrocuted by the security system when he's tried to escape some weird noise that he's hearing through the museum. So the murder mystery starts. The Doctor and Perry are understandably thought to be the murderers. It's very soon found out that's not the case, and they meet up with Gampman, the creator of the museum. Gampman ends up realising there may be something wrong by checking the timings of the recordings of Crane's speeches and realising the timings have changed, even though the speeches themselves sound correct. We then get a bit more of a murder mystery. The Doctor realises that Purnell is involved, and Purnell is utilising Crane's speeches to help basically become coronated as the candidate for replacing Crane, who recently died, and manipulating his speeches will basically endorse Beth as the successor to Crane through a audio broadcast. Crane is actually the audio creature that seems to be freaking out a few of the people in the museum, and then eventually Purnell and Stengard get involved as well in that. Stengard is effectively Purnell's secretary, very seditious, and it was actually Stengard who ended up murdering Crane, which the Doctor figures out after Crane recalls through an audio playback of his death. And it sounds like it was actually suicide, but actually if you get closer to it, the Doctor realises there's a tutting sound in the background, which is what Stengard does a lot throughout the story when he's dismayed or pitying somebody. He goes, and the Doctor realises it was Stengard that shot Crane, and that was all put out onto broadcast by Crane after an attempt for him to try and escape, because he's kind of like a very a creature you don't want to escape in the museum. He tried to escape via the broadcast. He was asked to stop by the Doctor eventually, and yeah, Purnell gets her comeuppance at the end, because not only does Crane manage to bring out the speech in regards to the right way of what happened and expose Purnell for who she is, she also ends up getting killed through her car going out of control when she leaves the museum at the end of the story. Overall, I quite like listening to this one. It's interesting. The early Big Finish ones are still playing with the genre and playing with the audio play, and this is basically utilising audio in a way that works for a plot line. They're in a museum of audio. Gampman is actually blind, which I thought was an interesting comment, or very horse-sighted anyway, because it's heavily inferred that Gampman can't see, because there's a couple of times he's speaking to people and he thinks he's speaking to people, then realises he's actually not speaking to people. He's actually speaking to, as it turns out, Crane in some cases, impersonating some of the other people in the museum. So obviously audio is his only sense left, and he does make a comment at one point that audio is one of his senses. The only main sense he's got left, which I thought was quite intriguing. It's quite lovely layered. I love the fact that they've kind of revealed the main plot line and the conspiracy fairly early on. It's in the second part that we realise, I think the Doctor sees through that rather quickly, that Purnell's trying to utilise Crane's speeches to use them for her own games, for political one-upmanship, or one-up-womanship. I don't know how that works nowadays. I think the phrase one-upmanship might work, I don't know. That's the setup, that's the layout, and it's just then finding out this creature, this monster, what we think is a monster, Vistine Crane, who's intent of trying to kill people and find out the truth of who it is, who's killed him and everything else, and realises it. It's interesting, it's a good listen, and it's only an hour and a half. I mean, these early audio dramas seem to be quite short. It was quite short for Phantasmagoria as well, if I remember rightly, but an hour and a half for Whispers of Terror, so it's about 23, 24 minutes an episode, so it's kind of close to what the running time would have been originally for most Doctor Who stories. It was an interesting little story, an interesting listen, and enjoyable to go through and go with intrigue and plot, but I learnt a lot more this time than I had casually listening previously, and it was at this time I realised that Gampman was actually blind, which is really cool to realise and figure out. This is where words and descriptions come in to actually show that you've only got the audio to talk about here, you don't have any video, so it's interesting seeing that. So we've got the Doctor, Colin Baker. This is post-Revelation of the Daleks, pre-Trial of a Time Lord, so he's still the pompous, slightly arrogant Doctor that we know of that era. The Doctor and Perry open the story arguing, which is a trait they continue from that series. We would have thought they'd start to mellow a little bit, but no, they're still at each other's throats. The Doctor has a dim view of a joke that Perry was trying to say, and Perry doesn't appreciate the way he said dim. He repeats a word 3 times. First time he repeats it in confusion, second time it's a bit more angry, and then there's a pause, and then he'll say it a third time, which seems to be a trait of the Sixth Doctor. It's used here as well. It's not quite like the character we saw in Silence of Time. It's more the Doctor that you know on screen, and playing on that, and playing with a companion at that time with that attitude. So it's not the Doctor that we will start to see of Colin Baker's Sixth Doctor later in the Big Finish audios. It's still the one the television series is more suited to at the moment. But Colin Baker doesn't put a foot wrong with anything he's putting across of him. I love the way that he's utilising his knowledge to figure out rather quickly what's happened to Fotherell and the situation with Crane and the plot with Purnell. I love the way he's managed to quickly get through that and get to the point that he needs to try and solve this mystery. And it is a kind of murder mystery of sorts, as well as that Monster of the Week elements. It's got a couple of lovely elements in it. You've then got Perry, played by Nicola Bryant. Standard Perry fare. To be fair, she doesn't get much. There's not much screaming, but she's kind of not quite Perry's appalling, but she's stumbling into a lot of situations and trying to tell the Doctor what's wrong, and he's saying, I'm too important. But it's not much of a role for Nicola Bryant in this one, which is a bit of a shame, because Nicola Bryant's good on audio with some of the stuff she does. It is more traditional. It's not like Phantasmagoria, where Turlough had an actual proper subplot. Perry is just going off every so often with different characters and coming back again into the action. So it's not so much intrigue, she's just like a plot device more than anything else, which is a shame. You then got Amber Dent, Rebecca Jenkins, fairly short. She ends up with a comeuppance in episode 2. Strong enough performance. Gough Fotherell, played by Hilton Collins, again, very short. He gets electrocuted by the security door he goes in the first episode, but those two together trying to manipulate Crane's speeches is an interesting plot point to start with. We've then got Matthew Brenher playing Vistine Crane. It's interesting how he goes through different voice timbres through this to get the kind of spookiness. There's a kind of sinister whispering from Crane initially that you hear with all the audio stuff, because obviously he's a creature. He doesn't know who he is 100% at that point. He's still trying to figure out who he is, and he is trying to find out who the person is at the end of the day. It's interesting how that works. And then eventually, as he gets to know who he is, he then becomes more of a big baddie figure, especially when he gets manipulated in the fourth episode by Purnell and Steingard, because he gets trapped in an audio disc at one point, and Steingard and Purnell find a way of actually hearing him without releasing him. So they manage to synthesize his voice and manipulate his sound file, which corrupts him and makes him a bit more willing to disrupt things and go out into the world and spread around the world through the broadcast that Purnell's about to do. And there's a nice little turn the way the character changes there. And then he goes back to the Vistine Crane we hear in the recordings near the end. There's a cancelling wave the Doctor puts in to cancel the broadcast coming through, and it heals Crane back to a normal person again and makes him better. So the whole emotions of how the sound and audio is played by Bruno comes through on this. You've then got Peter Miles, best known as playing Nida in Genesis of the Daleks. And Peter Miles plays it like an old man with knowledge and knows the museum inside and out, and it's a very sweet performance, which I quite like. We've then got Napton, played by Mark Trotman. He's like a student aspect who's basically assistant to Gampman. We don't see much of him in the second or third episode. He kind of turns up again in the fourth, and even then I'm not sure whether that's Crane or whether that is Napton that we're hearing at that point. But it's interesting how he's just like a sidekick that comes at the beginning and end of the story, doesn't do much in between really. You then got Berkeley, played by Nick Scovell. Nick Scovell would be better known not long afterwards playing the second Doctor in a stage play of Evil of the Daleks. And I think he's also did Power of the Daleks as well, if I remember rightly. But here he plays Berkeley, the detective who finds the Doctor and Perry by Fotherell's body and thinks that they did it. It's quite often they didn't very quickly. Berkeley then figures out there's a bit more of a murder case here. He goes into the background a little bit after the second episode. He's not really played much after that. So it's a bit of a shame, but Scovell does a good performance. We then have two of the more interesting characters. We have Hans Steingard, played by Stefan Bourget. I love the sadistic henchman that role he plays here, and he's there to make a means to an end to help Purnell. His tutting of disappointment he gets when you hear him throughout the story is really quite sinister. and it's all part of the recording playback that Crane plays back and gets recorded by the Doctor and Gantman when he's trying to speak to Beth initially. And you hear and you think it's a gun before he gets a gunshot to his head, because he says there's a gun at my head just beforehand, and you think it's maybe him hitting the trigger. It's not. It's actually Steingard tutting before he shoots Crane, and it's quite a sinister little role. And then you've got Beth Purnell, played by Lisa Bauman, who is the Big Finish alumni at this point. She's already done a series of Beneath Summerfield by this point for Big Finish, and it's the Beneath Summerfield series that let BBC think, yep, we can give them the license for Doctor Who. So she's a big part of Big Finish's early success, to be fair. And she plays the scheming Beth Purnell. But I do love the sinisterness of the way she plays it, and the way that she comes across as very career-minded, very much a politician, but very much in that vein of, oh, you nasty piece of. She really does have that nasty piece of work feeling to her, which is really, really cool to see, because Bauman tends to play very good roles. And, I mean, Beneath Summerfield's a flawed role, but it's still a goody-goody at the end of the day. And it's been lovely hearing her in a different context with a different character and showing her range there, because she is a big part of Big Finish even now, and she does get to play Benny alongside the 7th Doctor and the 8th Doctor in the audio range later on. But it's good and nice to hear Bauman playing a different role, and Beth Purnell's really the baddie. She's the enemy of the story, and it's really fun. We have the bit where Crane's speech is first manipulated. Perry stumbles in Dent doing the editing for it, and Perry thinks Crane says at one point, no single man, but actually Gantman says it should be a single man. And when it's played back, it says no single man, which is a bit weird. But you do hear that at the beginning, because that speech is played at the beginning when Gantman and Apton are listening to it. And then when it's manipulated again, Gantman quite rightly thinks it's been changed. The only way they figure it out is when they realise the timings of recordings have been tweaked, and they realise the recording's a little shorter or a little longer depending on what manipulations have been done, which I thought was quite interesting. The end of the first episode is more the fact of Dent getting overwhelmed by this kind of sound creature saying, tell me who this is, who are you? Dent knows what to do. Obviously at this point the creature, or Crane, is starting to realise that he's been manipulated. He's trying to find out who he is, and Dent nearly gets overwhelmed by the sound, effectively, which was interesting. We then have the revelation by Gantman in the second episode that Crane died in the museum. He was recording a speech in the museum. It's quoted that he rarely did visual interviews. He was an actor, but it was more like it's indicating that he's an audio actor more than a visual actor. And the Doctor wanted to question Purnell for the speech changes, but Purnell's playing on the basis that I can't remember, so she doesn't know. But it's Gantman obviously realises the timing difference. But it's interesting that Crane died in the museum, and that's how he's ended up being a creature in the Oral Antiquities, because somehow he got caught into the recordings when he's recording his speech. The recording equipment must have been on or something when Steingard killed him. It was interesting. We then have the scene where Steingard and Purnell torture Crane to get information and find a way to talk to him about releasing him. So Crane wanted to get copies out of himself with the speech on the broadcast, and the Doctor tries to stop Purnell with the broadcast, which doesn't work. The Doctor's pleadings ignores it. She cuts them off when he's trying to communicate with her through the audio system. He then tries to go to the broadcast room to stop Purnell that way, but gets interrupted by Crane, who is trying to stop him from stopping Purnell because he wants to proliferate himself in the broadcast. The Doctor manages to persuade Crane not to. And yes, it's interesting that the broadcast, initially the feed to the main studio where the feed's going to, has stopped because the Doctor put cancellation wave to cancel out any wave sounds. Crane was in that broadcast wave, so they gets healed from it. So it's an interesting way of getting around it. Steingard thinks there's an error he can fix. Crane fools him by saying thinks it's Purnell, and fools Steingard to use a live cable, and he electrocutes himself. He kills himself that way. Nice revenge. Purnell's dishonoured and finds out about the broadcast are different to what she wanted. Crane actually puts out something different to what Purnell was expecting, and that's what they hear out in the broadcast the second time round, which is interesting. The Doctor and Perry, at the end of this, all's well. Gantman goes back to being creator and Purnell leaves. And the Doctor and Perry are arguing again when they leave. It's kind of like, right, okay, there we are. We set up the relationship between the two of them. They argue. It's like, that wasn't the relationship of Perry and the Doctor at some point. There was some tenderness between the two of them. I don't understand that sometimes. And then Purnell is killed by the car going off the road by Crane. So Crane's obviously manipulated the controls on the car. Purnell is listening to voicemail messages, sees one from Steingard, plays the Steingard. It's Crane saying goodbye, Beth, and she dies, and that's the end of the episode. So it's an interesting way of getting her comeuppance, really. Overall, I don't mind this one. I quite like this one, and I'd give it a rating of 3.5 TARDISes out of 5. Let's see how that audio adventure stacks up against the rest of the Big Finish reviews done so far. Whispers of Terror joins the other two Big Finish audio adventures reviewed so far, of the Sirens of Time and Phantasmagoria, at 3.5 TARDISes out of 5. Don't worry, there are stories that will have a better rating than that coming very soon, I can assure you of that. That's it for now. Thanks guys for listening and watching, but if you have been, thank you. If you like this video, don't forget to like it and share it with the hashtag teamstructor. And if you like the channel as a whole, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notifications bell so you know when a new video comes out. General new video every Sunday at 4 PM GMT. But if you want to support the channel even more, you can go to the Patreon at patreon.com/Deanstructor. For as little as £1 a month or $1 a month, you can help support the channel. So just go to patreon.com/Deanstructor. The next video is at Wednesday at 6 PM GMT, and it's my review of The Doctor's Wife. I hope to see you then. I'm then back on Sunday at 4 PM GMT with a Kidstructor. Hopefully you can join me for that. Until next time guys, thanks very much for watching, or thanks very much for listening of course, and I'll see you later.